Jennifer, I'm still showing that I'm muted. Am I muted?
No, you're not muted. You can go ahead and get started.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone to our January meeting of the Daughters of the American Revolution. This is one of our more exciting meetings because we usually try to get Daryl Dexter here, and sure enough, he's here today. For those of you who might be on and not be familiar with Daughters of the American Revolution, we are a not-profit service organization, and we focus on patriotism, service projects, genealogy, and historical education. So we're very pleased today to have Daryl Dexter with us. Many of you know that he is an author, historian, and a teacher as well. So he's got a lot of interest and active engagement in Southern Illinois history. Today he's going to be talking about General Grant in Little Egypt. So that's a pretty broad subject, but I'm excited to hear about it. And before we start, I would just like to have a little bit of our opening ritual read. So by the virtue of the authority vested in me as the regent of Daniel H. Brush chapter of the United chapter of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution, I now declare this meeting in session to perpetuate the memory and spirit of the men and women who achieved American independence, to promote the development and enlightened public opinion, and to foster patriotic citizenship. These are the objects of the National Society Daughters of the American Revolution. So with that, I will turn it over to Daryl Dexter, and we'll start this fun webinar.
All right, thank you, Jill. Before I begin, I want to, of course, thank Jill and the Daniel Brush chapter for inviting me to speak to you once again, and also a special thanks to Jennifer Robertson, who's at the Carbondale Public Library. She's the one that's coordinating our technology. I'm not a very techie person, so this is the first time I've presented in a webinar before. I've been in the audience in many webinars, but I've never presented this way. So I hope you'll bear with me. It's a little different. It's a little awkward for me. I notice we have 30 people that have joined us, and I just want to encourage you to ask questions. And one of the advantages, of course, to this type of a format is that as I'm speaking, if you come up with a question that you'd like to ask, you can type that into the chat box, or there's also at the bottom of the screen a Q&A, and you can use either one of those. So if a question comes to mind at the beginning or as I go through this, please go ahead and ask that question, and then towards the end, Jill will share those questions with me. It probably, for those of you that aren't that familiar with Southern Illinois history, it probably is kind of strange to talk about Grant in Egypt, because some people would think, well, when did Ulysses S. Grant ever go to Egypt? And Egypt, of course, is a term that we use for Southern Illinois. And this is a term that's been around since the 1830s. In 1830, in the winter of 1830 and early 1831, we had what's called the winter of the deep snow. And during that winter of the deep snow, we had as late as May, we still had frost in Illinois, especially in the central and northern part of the state. And then it started frosting again as early as September. So the growing season was shortened for people, especially in central Illinois. And so their corn crop didn't survive. They didn't even have seed to plant their corn crop. So the farmers in the central part of the state came down to southern Illinois to buy seed corn for their next year. And many of them, being familiar with stories from the Bible that they'd either read or heard read to them, they said this is like going into Egypt whenever the Hebrews went into Egypt during a famine. And southern Illinois has been known as Egypt pretty much since that time. The earliest record that I can find that we refer to southern Illinois as Egypt is in an 1849 newspaper in Cairo. So this is a story that's pretty well documented, and the name seems to have stuck to us down here in southern Illinois as Egypt. General Grant's first appearance here in southern Illinois was on May 16th, 1861. And he was ordered, he had volunteered his services first to General McClellan, who had kind of ignored his request to become a part of the U.S. Union forces. He had been in the Army before, and of course he had gone to West Point. He had been in the Army through the Mexican War, had several different Army positions and served in different posts in Oregon, California, New York, I think Michigan, and he resigned from the Army. But when the Civil War started, he volunteered his services once again. And he finally was accepted in as a colonel. He was named the colonel of the 21st Illinois. But his first appearance here in southern Illinois was on May 16, 1861, when he arrived in the town of Anna, Illinois. And Anna in Union County, of course, is right on the Illinois Central Railroad. And his orders were to come to Anna and inspect and muster in the 18th Illinois Infantry. I'm sure there are probably people that are listening who have ancestors who served in the 18th, especially if they're from Union County. A lot of people from Union County signed up and enlisted in the 18th Illinois, and they would have been mustered into the service by General Grant. He stayed at Camp Douglas, which, thanks to the research of Dr. White Mountain, she's located the place of Camp Douglas. And Camp Douglas was, it seems, about a mile north of Anna along the Illinois Central. And Grant stayed there at Camp Douglas for 6 days. He was getting homesick for his wife, and he wrote a letter to his wife, Julia, from Camp Anna. And he said, quote, "Once through here," in other words, at Anna, "I hope there will be no further need of me." So he had seen enough, it seemed already, of service in the Union Army. But his stay in Anna during those 6 days, he got an impression, his first impression of what Southern Illinois was like. And there were lots of reports in newspapers that people in Southern Illinois were pro-Confederate, that they were going to secede from the state and join the Confederacy, or they were going to become neutral and try to solve or bring peace between the North and the South. But on May 21st, rather, he wrote another letter to his wife before he left Anna, and he said, quote, "I am through at this place and will leave in about 1 hour for Cairo, where I shall only remain until evening. I've been agreeably disappointed in the people of Egypt. It is the prevailing opinion abroad that the people of this section of the state are ignorant, disloyal, intemperate, and generally heathenish. The fact is, the regiment formed here is the equal, if not the superior, of any of the regiments raised in the state, for all the virtues of which they were charged with being deficient. So he was agreeably disappointed. He expected something and he got surprised. We were more loyal, more temperate, and a better quality of soldier for the Union Army than he thought. Grant didn't go, I mean, he did go from Anna to Cairo, but that was just to catch the train to go further north. It was several months before Grant came to be stationed in Cairo, Illinois. And the picture in the presentation is a photograph that was taken of Cairo in 1858, probably the earliest photograph or the earliest that I've ever seen. And this, of course, was right after the flood of 1858. So this is Cairo at its worst. It had gone through a flood and much of the city had been destroyed. Many of the houses just floated away. Some of them lifted up in the flood and were just moved from their first location. But when Grant came to Cairo, there were a couple thousand people there. So in 1860, according to the population, Cairo had a population of 2,188 people. That's about 200 more than the population of Cairo today. But Cairo was a strategic point. It only had 2,000 people there in 1860, but it's right at the confluence where the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers converge. It's where they come together. And before I forget, let me just encourage everybody, if you've never been to Cairo, if you've never been to the point where the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers converge, make a trip to Cairo. There's a tower that you can climb, and it gives a magnificent view of the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers coming together. Secretary of War under the Lincoln administration was a man named Simon Cameron. And he wrote a letter to the governor of Illinois. His name was Governor Richard Yates. And he said, quote, "As soon as enough of your troops is mustered into service, send a brigadier general with 4 regiments at or near Grand Cairo." So early on, Cairo was recognized as a strategic point, a place that was going to become important in the Civil War. The first soldiers arrived April 23rd, 1861. They came in on an Illinois Central train, and there were about 1,000 of them. So not a large contingent, but they rode in, one historian said, they rode into the astonishment of all and the rage of many citizens. There were some people in Cairo and Southern Illinois early on who weren't sold on the idea of a civil war, who weren't sold on the idea of fighting their Southern brethren. But by the end of the week, 2,000 more soldiers had come in. By June, there were 6,800 stationed at Cairo. And by mid-September, that's when Grant arrived. By mid-September, there were 16,500 men at Cairo and in the Cairo area. So there were several forts or camps a few miles up the Mississippi River and a few miles up the Ohio. Of course, there were soldiers stationed at Bird's Point, which is across the river from Cairo in Missouri, and then Fort Holt, which is just across the Missouri in Kentucky from Cairo. Winfield Scott, who was the top-ranking general at the beginning of the Civil War, he sent an order and he said that Cairo should be heavily fortified at the confluence. So not only did they need soldiers stationed there, but they needed it to be fortified. Cannons needed to be placed there. They did begin to build a fort, and it had different names. At the beginning, it was called Fort Darling. Then it became Fort Union. Then they named it Fort Prentiss after one of the commanders at Cairo. Became Fort Cairo, and then eventually, as it's still known today, Fort Defiance. One of the things they needed to do was to build that area. There was no fort there. They needed to build it. And they needed to cut down some of the trees. There were some buildings that needed to be removed. This is a photograph that, or not a photograph, but a pen and ink drawing from Harper's Weekly, which was a national newspaper / magazine that people across the country and in Europe would read. And the artist happened to catch the soldiers at the time. They were tearing down a distillery to make way for the fort. And this was Arter and Harold's distillery. The London newspaper actually sent a correspondent at Cairo in the early years when Grant was stationed there. And so Cairo was not only well known throughout the country, Cairo was well known throughout many places in Europe and other parts of the world. And this correspondent described the area where they were building the fort as just kind of a swamp area, and that the swamp needed to be drained. And that once it was cleared, then they had to bring in dirt to fill it in. The cannons were put there. They had 4, and I'm not a military historian, so the numbers and names of these armaments don't mean as much to me, but maybe someone in the audience. They had 4 32-pounders. They had a 64-pounder howitzer, mortar, and several 6-pounders that were stationed right at the point. People thought, if you read early newspapers in Illinois and Missouri, people thought Cairo was about to be attacked. And they thought, we need to fortify Cairo. We need to fortify it so that Confederates don't invade. There were always rumors. Every week there was a new rumor. They said 75 desperados from Cape Girardeau are getting ready to invade and attack Cairo, Illinois. If there's 16,000 soldiers there, I don't think 75 desperados, as they were called, from Cairo was much of a threat. But there was this fear that if the Union Army didn't fortify Cairo there at the confluence where the two rivers came together, that the Southern Confederacy would. As more and more people came in, soldiers came into Cairo, they built barracks. In the beginning, the soldiers just slept on the ground. Then they built or put up tents and slept under tents, but still on the ground. And then gradually, as you can see from the photograph, they began building barracks. You also can see why the correspondent from the London paper referred to that as a swamp area. So there's a big problem with seep water when you're that close to the river. So that's also why the dirt fill was made. The Cairo Weekly newspaper in August 1861 said, from morning until nightfall, and sometimes later, the commands, order arms, shoulder arms, support arms, is heard in every part of the camp. Soldiers were stationed, and one historian said that 1 million soldiers at one time went through, in or out of Cairo. I don't know if that number is correct. There were never, of course, that many stationed there. Probably the 16 to 20,000 is the greatest number that were ever there at any one time. But soldiers throughout the war were coming in and out of Cairo. And a lot of them would write letters home. And a lot of these letters have been preserved by family And it seems that the complaint of the people the soldiers at Cairo were the rats and the mosquitoes. Those are the top two complaints. And one newspaper reporter from Chicago said the only complaint we hear from men here in Cairo is that they enlisted to fight the Southern rebels. But instead of being allowed an indulgence in such pastimes, they are brought here to fight a merciless horde of damned Cairo mosquitoes. In addition to the soldiers stationed at Cairo, of course, upriver, up the Ohio, there was the place where they built the ironclads. And before the war, maybe 20 steamboats would pull into Cairo every day. It wasn't unusual for steamboats to come in, and then also smaller flatboats, people going up and down the river from New Orleans, they would pull into Cairo. The Secretary of the Treasury was Salmon P. Chase, and the Secretary of the Treasury also knew about Cairo, and he ordered a blockade at Cairo. And the surveyor of the customs in the port in Cairo was a man named Levi Leitner. And he received in early May 1861, he received orders that said, don't let anything south of Cairo unless you inspect it. So they were afraid that guns and ammunition would make it in to the Confederacy. So every boat that came to Cairo, from the shore, they would fire a shot across the bow as a warning that boat had to come in to the wharves and be inspected. Any boat going upriver towards St. Louis had to come in and be inspected. They wouldn't let not only military armaments and supplies go into the Confederacy by ship, but eventually the order was expanded to include all food items as well. The paymaster came to Cairo for the first time in July 1861. It doesn't seem to matter where they were in the Union Army. Soldiers complained about not getting their pay on time. It may be weeks or months before the paymaster would show up with their pay, but in July, $200,000 was sent in gold to pay off the troops. And of course, Cairo businesses boomed. Soldiers had money in their pocket. And so what type of people are attracted to soldiers and men away from their family with money in their pockets? The Chicago Tribune said this in May 1861. They said, quote, every other house on the levee is a saloon and everyone has a guard stationed at the door to preserve order. Gamblers were attracted. They wanted to take advantage of the soldiers. They had money to spend, thought they were lucky, and professional gamblers showed up in the camps. Prostitution existed in Cairo. Even before the war, Cairo was known as kind of the den of iniquity in some ways when it comes to prostitution. There are even stories of the hotel in Cairo. There's a beautiful hotel that didn't burn, I think, until the 1950s, called the St. Charles, and then later they called it the Halliday. But one person wrote home and said that as he was walking by the St. Charles Hotel, that prostitutes and women of the evening would hang off the balcony and try to entice soldiers to come in. I don't know how true those are, but there were stories like that. One historian, in writing the county history in 1883, he said, quote, greenbacks were aplenty and morals were scarce. So you can read into that what you will, believe how much of that you want. But that was the Cairo that General Grant entered when he arrived in the town September 4th, 1861. And this is a photograph that shows, you can see the barracks in the background. The flag is flying outside the doctor's headquarters or hospital, kind of more like a first aid center. And then you can see the buildings, but you can see the point in the Mississippi River in the far background. This was the Cairo that Grant would have seen. He arrived when Colonel Richard Ogleby was the commander at Cairo, and Grant just walked into Ogleby's headquarters. And when he walked into Ogleby's headquarters, he didn't have his uniform on. And that's always puzzled me, why a general would show up to take command of a post in civilian clothes. But he didn't have his uniform on. As a matter of fact, it was a week before his uniform arrived, after he had been in Cairo. So when he walked into the office, Colonel Ogleby just ignored him. There were always civilians walking in and out, wanting to talk to him. So he ignored Colonel Grant until finally General Grant said, "Excuse me, but I'm here to take command." And he had his papers, his official orders. He handed them to Ogleby, and he looked at them and kind of shocked or surprised, said, "Yes, sir." And he turned over the command of Cairo then to General Grant. He wrote a letter home to his wife, and General Grant said this after he was in Cairo for just about a week. He said, quote, "Cairo is not half so unpleasant a place as I supposed it would be. I have a nice office and I live with the members of my staff immediately back of it. I did stay about a week at the St. Charles, but I got very tired of it." So I think we can read into that when we look at what other places, especially Chicago newspapers, St. Louis newspapers, were saying about Cairo in Southern Illinois, it wasn't that bad. And now here are two occasions where General Grant has documented the fact that these people aren't as bad as you say they are. These aren't such bad people, and Cairo's not such a bad place. When his uniform arrived, he got his picture taken. So this is a photograph taken of Grant in Cairo, Illinois. And I want to call attention to his long beard. Notice the long beard that hangs down, and then looks like it's been cut off straight across at the bottom. It doesn't look like his uniform fits very well. But this was his first photograph taken in Cairo. As far as I know, the only photograph. Well, no, there is one other one that was taken of him in Cairo. But his wife arrived. His wife was Julia Dent, and they had been married since, I think, 1848, if my memory's correct. But when she arrived in Cairo at his request, she took one look at General Grant and said, "You've got to cut that beard off. That beard's got to go." So of course he didn't shave the whole thing, but he cut that long part that's hanging down. She convinced him that that was the thing to do. General Grant had 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter, and Julia brought them all down to Cairo. Actually, the oldest son, Frederick or Freddie, had been down earlier and stayed with just General Grant for some time. But they all stayed at his headquarters. And his headquarters were on the 3rd story bank building. And this building was used, and I think it was torn down, if I'm not mistaken, also in the 1950s. So the building is no longer there, but that was the bank building. And the 3rd floor was not only where his official headquarters were, but that's also where his sleeping quarters were and where his family's sleeping quarters were. He made lots of new friends in Cairo, 2 in particular, William P. Halliday and Charles Gallagher. He would come back to visit Charles Gallagher Gallagher had the Magnolia Manor. Most of you have probably been to Cairo and at least driven by, if not into, the Magnolia Manor. Beautiful house, and especially beautiful at Christmas time. But he also wrote something interesting, at least something I found interesting, when he wrote his memoirs. And he said, Grant said, quote, while at Cairo, I had frequent opportunities of meeting the rebel officers of the Columbus garrison. So right across the river, the Confederate soldiers were. He said they seemed to be very fond of coming up on steamers under a flag of truce. On 2 or 3 occasions, I went down in a like manner. There were several officers among them whom I had known before, both at West Point and in Mexico. So the Confederate officers and the Union officers, many of them were close friends before the Civil War started. And so Grant took every opportunity while he was at Cairo. They were just across the river in Kentucky. He would go down and talk to them. They would come up and talk to him under a flag of truce. He was only in Cairo. Grant was here 4 days before he issued his order number 5. And order number 5 said basically this. He said, okay, since I've been in Cairo, I've seen some things that I don't like. And he said, I've seen my officers and soldiers fraternizing with each other. And he said in General Orders 5, quote, visiting the lowest drinking and dancing saloons, quarrel, they curse, drink, and carouse, general on the lowest level of equality. And he didn't like that. I don't know if he didn't like that they were drinking and carousing, or if he didn't like that the officers were doing it with the enlisted men. I'm not sure which he was the most offended by. He also said he closed all the dancing saloons, closed all the houses of prostitution in Cairo, closed all the drinking houses. And he said, quote, being satisfied that the closing of the tippling and other disorderly houses of this city and vicinity is essential to the preservation of good order and proper discipline at this post. So he closed down every bar in Cairo. Now, Cairo had lots of bars. Cairo had lots of saloons, and lots of money was made by businessmen who I doubt at that time were probably compensated for losing their business. But the Cairo City Weekly paper seemed to like what Grant was doing. September 12th, after this order was issued, they said, quote, General Grant has infused a new vigor into affairs here and elsewhere where he is assigned authority. He's making a reputation. Didn't say good or bad, just said he's making a reputation. Since the arrivals of General Grant, a new and more satisfactory condition of things concerning police matters has been inaugurated. So there had been occasions where soldiers would sneak out of camp to go carouse and drink, especially at night. And the order said you can't leave camp unless you have a pass. The newspaper man from Cairo, from the Cairo Gazette, around Christmas time, a few months later, said this though. He said, quote, a few lucky logs got enough liquor to make themselves drunk and took especial pains to post themselves in public places that everybody else might envy them. We saw but 3 intoxicated persons at Christmas. We never passed a more quiet day in Cairo in our lives. So some people, because it wasn't just closed for soldiers, all the saloons were closed. And some people resented that and blamed General Grant. One person who didn't resent it, I'm sure, is Mother Angela. And those of you that heard me speak a year or so ago about the hospital at Mound City and Cairo, maybe remember me talking about Mother Angela. She and about 13 other sisters from Holy Cross arrived in Cairo, and they came to take charge of the hospital at Cairo and also the hospital at Mound City. There had been female nurses in Cairo before Mother Angela arrived. Some famous ones were Mary Livermore, Mother Bickerdike, and then of course Mary Jane Safford, who was from Cairo herself. Mother Angela walked up when she got into Cairo. She walked right up to the first military officer she saw and said, "I'm looking for General Grant." And the officer took her to General Grant. He was sitting behind his desk, probably kicked back. He had his pipe in his mouth, smoking. And she said, "I'm here to take charge of the hospital." And in a very quiet, matter-of-fact tone, he said, quote, "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you've come. If there's anything you may need, let me know, and I'll try to supply it." And he supplied a wagon to take her and the other sisters to Mound City, which unfortunately broke down on their way, and the sisters got out to push it through the mud. And it's kind of a funny story, but a lot of the sisters came back after the Civil War, and they started St. Mary's Infirmary in 1867. That's where I was born, and maybe some other people listening were born in Cairo, and I was born there in 1962. People said about Grant in their reminiscence, they said, well, he always had a cigar in his mouth. When he was in Cairo, he always had a cigar in his mouth. He did have a weakness for alcohol, and if you study his military career, especially before the Civil War, he was moved from post to post, and the reason he was asked to resign was because he appeared drunk before his commanding officer. And there wasn't just one instance, and alcohol was indulged in excess commonly by men and some women in the 1800s and early 1800s. So he did have a weakness for alcohol. People that have studied his career and life say he was not an alcoholic, but there were times when he did overindulge. A newspaper in Cairo wrote this about Grant in September 1861. So it's 10 days, or rather 10 years. Not alcohol, by the way, just water. They wrote this 10 years after Grant was in Cairo, and it was published in the newspaper. And they talked about him having stayed sometimes at the St. Charles Hotel. And the newspaper reporter was talking about a dog that had just died, which had been a special pet or favorite of General Grant whenever he was in Cairo. And the dog's name was Bridget. And this is what the reporter said, quote, "She was a Union dog from the point of her nose to the tip of her tail. Grant was in command here, and it was a noticeable fact that is as if aware that he was the coming great man and savior of his country. Bridget always stood awed in his presence, and when he would fall down drunk, would watch over him with a mother's care." Troops continued pouring into Cairo. There were 6,000 new arrivals in Cairo in February 1862, right before Grant pushed his invasion of the South. There was the Battle of Fort Donelson in early 1862. February 16th, General Grant's wife and the children left Cairo, and they didn't come back to Cairo. I think Julia Grant was with Grant when he returned to Cairo, but the family left for their home in Galena, February 16th, 1862 by train. And General Grant said he saw little of Cairo after the Fort Donelson victory. and that was in February of 1862. He left Cairo for the last time, other than his later visit after he was president, February 17th, 1862. He stayed in Cairo for several months, and it was an important time of his military career. It's when he made the plans for the invasion of the South. It was an important time for him. He made several close friends while he was there. But we have to remember that his impact and the impact on the Civil War, the impact it had on us here in Southern Illinois and Cairo in particular, was even greater than that. I hope I have generated a few questions. Jill? Up, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I mean, that's probably more information than anyone on this earth has about General Grant in Southern Illinois. We do have several questions. Let's see, which are in the chat. Somehow they didn't end up in the Q&A, but pull them up. Let's see. Let's start. Did Grant stay at Bell Hill Bed and Breakfast that you are aware? Was he involved ever in what happened to the 109th Division, which has been criticized for being a Southern sympathizing division?
Okay, so I guess the Bell Hill that's referred to is the one in Cobden.
Yes.
Right. As far as I know, Grant was never there. That doesn't mean he wasn't, but I've never seen any reference to that or mention of it in any records that I've looked at. General Grant did have a connection with the 109th. That's true. I have two ancestors that fought in the 109th and many related great uncles and so forth. The 109th was sent south from Cairo in April 1862 after Grant had already left. So they were sent, and of course Grant was headed when he left Cairo through Kentucky. We have, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Battle of Shiloh. He's headed to claim Vicksburg. That's the prize he's after. And the role of the 109th was to be sent to Vicksburg to be ready when that battle occurred. And the 109th were attacked at Vicksburg. They were on the outskirts. They were attacked by the Confederates, and they didn't fight. And the officers had suggested, some of them were officially discharged, but some of them had suggested to the commander, the colonel of the company or regiment, that they should surrender to the Confederates. And General Grant, they didn't surrender. Some of them did get paroled by the Confederates, but they weren't able to hold off the Confederate invasion of a little place called Holly Springs, Mississippi. And the 109th was blamed for that, and they were placed under arrest, and that was under order of General Grant. He was aware of what the 109th had done. The blame of that was put in on the heads basically of a few commanding officers who were subsequently discharged from the military.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, next question. It seems Grant's first impression of Southern Illinois people still remains. How or why or how can we change that?
I don't know, maybe hire a PR person. There's still, of course, a bias. But honestly, I think having met people from Northern Illinois, and I think many people from Southern Illinois have a similar bias against people from Chicago and from the northern part of the state. So I think the bias is shared both ways. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I do know that Cairo, Illinois in particular gets lots, even today, I believe, gets lots of bad press, and it's not warranted. I think that is changing in the local press, but it has in the past, even in recent past, kind of been picked on when it shouldn't have been, and Southern Illinois in general.
Okay. Let's see. Where did you get all of these great photos for your presentation?
Okay, a lot of them came from the Library of Congress. And then a lot of the pen and ink sketches came from Harper's Weekly, which is available. I think every issue is available online. And let's see. The photos of Camp Smith were Library of Congress photos, Camp Prentiss. Most of those are that she's referring to or he's referring to came from there. There are a few of them that are actually from an old postcard collection of Cairo that I have.
Well, it certainly would be nice to think someday there might be a, I hate to call it a coffee table book, but, you know, some kind of illustrated book about, you know, the Civil War in Southern Illinois, because a lot of those photos, I mean, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it's they're pretty telling too, you know,
Right.
about what Cairo looked like. And
obviously, right. Yeah. More so than the pen and ink sketches. You can flatter with those, but, you know, photograph is a little more revealing.
yeah, what it is. All right, let's see. Next question. With all its geographic importance at the confluence of two of the greatest rivers in the world, why did Cairo never become a major commercial hub, i.e. like St. Louis?
I think in large part it was because of the rivers and the potential flooding. There were levees around the city of Cairo, but the manufacturing, a lot of it was outside the levee system. So I think the Sears and Roebuck building, which was in Cairo, there were some other mills that were there. Those were subject to flooding, and when they shut the flood walls, and every few decades, there seemed to be a major flood. And I think that probably hurt Cairo quite a bit. But I think with the new port that's coming into Cairo, I think there will be changes economically in not just that town, but the entire region.
Okay, good. Let's see, next one. Amazing what circumstances Grant was willing to accept in order to do his job, i.e. where he lived, what kind of, you know, cold, hot, you know, not, I mean, he was probably in a lot of people who, you know, didn't always agree with him. And so why was Grant so willing to accept or, you know, take faith in Southern Illinois as, you know, a Union stronghold?
I don't think he did have faith in Southern Illinois at first, but I think Southern Illinois proved itself. All the counties contributed, with a few exceptions, contributed more soldiers by volunteering than other parts of the state. And I think Southern Illinois proved itself in the Civil War, proved its loyalties. were with the North, proved that its loyalties were with the Union Army. And there are notable exceptions, of course, but I think that's why.
Okay. All right, next question. I am a bit confused about Grant's rank. You call him general, but you mentioned he came as colonel.
Right. He became a general soon after. He was actually, when he first volunteered for the service in the Civil War, he contacted McClellan, who didn't respond, supposedly because Grant did have a reputation of alcohol abuse. And then he went to General Lyons in St. Louis, who also didn't respond. But there was a Congressman Washburn who did intervene on behalf of Grant and saw that he was named the colonel of a regiment. I think it was the 21st Regiment. So he started off as colonel. I don't remember exactly the date that he got the title of general, but I'm pretty sure it was before he came to Cairo.
Okay.
And I think it was before, he may have even been before he came to Anna. I think it was in April 61 that he was given the title, but I'm not positive about the date.
The title of colonel?
Of general, yeah. He was a colonel from the beginning when he became the commander of the 21st Illinois, and then he advanced in rank from there.
Okay. We have one comment that says, if this information was shared with school children, it would go a long way to let everyone know our wonderful history here.
I agree.
Okay, this is a question. Did the soldiers experience a flood during their time there?
Yes. In 1862, the last picture in the slide presentation showed Cairo inundated. That was the title. And there was a flood in 1862. And the streets of Cairo, of course, were mud or they were dirt. And so when it rained, even though Cairo had a levee system that protected the city itself, the seepwater would still come up. And they would have pumps that would run to pump the water out. But there was a flood in 1862, and there are lots of complaints from soldiers about the mud parading in the mud. And so the flood itself, they were protected behind the levee. The waters on the Ohio or Mississippi never breached the levee, but there was high waters.
Okay. All right, we have another question. Before the war or while in Anna and Cairo, did Grant indicate any preference for Democratic, Republican, or Constitutional Union Party or no party in 1860? When did Grant first meet John A. Logan?
Okay. So Grant, of course, I'd mentioned he became president in the I guess he was first elected in 68. And he was not political. And he didn't think military, as a commander in the military, he should necessarily get involved in politics, or at least not in partisan politics. And he was selected by the Republican Party, but there were a lot of people that weren't sure what party he was. So before they selected him to run as a Republican, they had to find out, well, what party are you? So since they weren't aware for sure of what party he was, I don't think he was very outspoken about politics or partisan politics. And of course, the Republican Party that he eventually joins wasn't organized until 1854. Who would he have voted for in 1860? I'm sure he voted, I would guess, Lincoln, but I don't know for sure.
Okay. All right. Next question, did Grant interact with Logan at Cairo?
I'm not sure. Logan, of course, was commander of the 31st, and they were stationed, parts of them at Mound City and Cairo for a time. I would suspect that they ran into each other. I don't know for sure of any communication that's been recorded between them, at least not that comes to mind right away. Later, of course, Logan becomes a very prominent Republican himself.
Right. Do you think they ever met or?
Oh, I'm sure they met. Oh, yes, especially after the war. And I would suspect during the war. Logan's men, though, went towards, as I recall, and again, I'm not a military historian, but as I recall, Logan's men went towards the east, because I know it seems like they were involved in the March to the Sea several years later. Whether Logan's the 31st were under command of Grant for the whole part of the war, I'm not sure. But
okay, and I think the last question we have is, well, we have two more questions now. When did the camp at Cairo get dismantled?
I know it was after the Civil War, and I don't know exactly when it was abandoned, but the Civil War was over at that time. One interesting thing about that was that they buried the soldiers that died in Cairo. They buried them at the camp. They buried them at Fort Defiance near the levee. Mm-hmm. And the graves were marked. And in the 1870s, when they gave a man the job of going around to all the different battle sites and places like Cairo, Fort Defiance, where soldiers had been buried, to exhume the bodies and remove them to Mound City National Cemetery. There were quite a few, dozens, if not more than that, buried there at Cairo. And then there were graves that were found at Fort Smith or Fort Prentiss or Villa Ridge. There were graves moved from there to the National Cemetery at Mound City. But when it was dismantled, I'm not sure. One other interesting kind of sidebar is that where the point is today isn't where the point was in 1861. So because of the flooding, so much sedimentation has been added that actually where the fort is not in what's called Fort Defiance Park. It's further to the north towards Cairo.
Okay. I think you've already answered this, but do you believe that Grant had like a personal interaction with Logan at Cairo?
Yeah, I couldn't answer that one. I would have to look back over
or at any
research
or at any time. Do you think he had a phone call, fax, letter?
I'm pretty sure they didn't communicate with Facebook or use their cell phones to talk to each other. But I don't want to say sure, but I'm confident because Logan was also from Illinois. Grant was from Illinois, although different parts of the state. And both men rose to high ranks in the military during the Civil War. Both men became high-ranking Republican Party officials. And of course, Logan ran for vice president unsuccessfully as a Republican candidate. I'm sure they were aware of each other and met. I would think probably during the war and almost certainly after.
All right. Well, in Southern Illinois, I guess we know John A. Logan as being, one of the key leaders to bring, many of the people who may have wanted to fight on the Union cause to bring them into the, or the Confederate cause to bring them into the
Right.
Union cause. And so there's always this thought about, how did Logan, being from this area, how did he transform his thoughts from, being pro Confederate to pro Union, and did Grant influence that, or?
I would say probably not, because Logan, when he was allegedly leaning towards the Confederacy, he was in Congress. He was serving in Congress at the time, and he was in Congress at the first Battle of Bull Run, right outside of Washington, D.C. And he claimed in a letter back to his wife that he had picked up a gun from the battlefield and fought with a Massachusetts regiment on the side of the Union Army. So there's still a lot of debate whether he was truly anti-Union or not loyal. He came back to Southern Illinois after that, left Congress, and of course he was supposedly going around. I don't know, he was a politician, so I don't know if he was just kind of testing the waters to see what people really felt, but he definitely did early on come out very strong pro-Union. And so there may have been a time very early on when it was questionable, but I think he came out strongly pro-Union before Grant took command.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't think it's related to Grant, in my opinion.
All right. Well, we're at the end of our questions and at the end of our time frame, but if somebody has one more question or something, I'm looking through the questions. I don't think it's anything that we haven't answered, but certainly this webinar will be available to review again online through the Carbondale Public Library. If you weren't able to participate and you registered, you can certainly listen to it again. Daryl, we thank you very much for your continued interest in Southern Illinois and the type of research that you do, which is very detailed, non-compromising, and true. And we really appreciate the subject that you cover. Nobody else is doing this, so.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the invitation. And if someone has questions, they can always send me an email. I'm pretty easy to find on the internet. So.
Okay, you want to just tell us what your email is while we got people online?
Okay, sure. If you have a question or want to contact me, it's simply darreldexter@hotmail.com. All lowercase, DARREL, Dexter@hotmail.com.
Okay.
And I'll get back to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
All right.
Jennifer, is there anything else I need to?
Nope, that's all. You can just say goodbye, and we'll go ahead and end it.
All right. Well, I certainly appreciate all the people who have participated in this webinar. And I thank the Carbondale Public Library for putting this together, because we certainly couldn't have done it on our own. And this is a great way to learn from specific people who have specific education, intellect, etc., about Illinois history and culture. So